begin by saying that I'm deeply grateful for the honor that Dr. Borgova bestowed on me today. I know that it's coming in connection with the 400th celebration of the existence of the university. And I can't help but reflect that the University of Cordova has come fairly long distance in its 400 years. It started as a Jesuit seminary, and after 400 years it has come to the point of giving an honorary degree to Luther, which I think its founders would have frowned. My subject today is central banking, stability, and the distribution of income. Now, the stability or instability of the market economy is an issue that has been all but ignored in macroeconomics for several decades now. And within the subfield of monetary economics, the distribution of income has been similarly ignored. It has been a non-topic for generations. The recent crisis tells us, I think, in no uncertain terms, that we have to pay more attention to these two topics. Now, stability and distribution make up 2/3 of my title. The remaining third is central banking. And I will argue in this lecture that financial deregulation and monetary policy have not only played a very significant role in generating the financial crisis, but have also been important in bringing about a large and significant shift in the distribution of income over the last 2 or 3 decades. I'm going to talk mostly about the United States in this connection, actually. I hope you'll forgive me for doing it. Now, stability first. The lack of attention to the stability of the financial system is at first sight quite surprising, because every economist knows about bank runs. But in the United States, deposit insurance has eliminated runs on deposit banks ever since the Great Depression. Runs on other banks in the world, and there have been a significant number of them, made no impact on an economics profession that has been too much dominated by the American profession. And the American profession apparently regarded the problem of bank runs as a solved problem that could be put aside. Now, the present crisis, now in its 5th or 6th year, demands a reappraisal. It also demonstrates that the problem has changed. It has metamorphosed. For old-fashioned bank runs were basically not involved this time. There was just, as far as I know, one exception. That was the run on the Northern Rock Bank in the United Kingdom, which actually showed the traditional picture of depositors lining up down the streets hoping to get their money out of the bank. So, the change in the nature of the problem shows us that we economists have much to learn before we can be confident that we know how the present-day financial system can be governed in a reliable and safe manner. Second part of my topic, distribution. For a very long time, monetary economics has been dominated by theories in which money is neutral. In theories of neutral money, monetary policy has only evanescent effects on the allocation of resources, and it affects the distribution of income or wealth only to the extent that people fail to anticipate inflation correctly when they enter into nominal contracts. But money is not neutral in the present monetary regime. It is obvious that monetary policy has had very significant effects on the allocation of productive resources in the long run-up to the crisis. It's perhaps a little bit less obvious that it has also affected the distribution of income, but I believe it has, and I will argue that as we go along. Now, let us first look back a bit. If we go back a century, the two great names in monetary economics 100 years ago were Knut Wicksell, a Swede, and Irving Fisher. Both those two were intensely preoccupied with the distributive consequences of monetary management. In fact, it was very largely this concern with the effect of money on the distribution of income that motivated all their work in monetary economics. Wicksell sought to find a way to manage money so as to stabilize the price level, and so that you could avoid price changes that would change the real outcome of nominal contracts. Fisher, perhaps less optimistic about the chances of what Wicksell tried to do, advocated a scheme that he called the compensated dollar. A scheme to correct the distributional effects of changes in the price level. Both of them saw distributive effects of changes in the price level as offenses against any concept of social justice, and consequently as a threat to the social stability and political stability. Now, Wicksell and Fisher were, of course, both aware of the potential instability of fractional reserve banking systems, of the economic recessions that resulted from every time you had a run on the banks. This was a commonplace, not just to them, but to all their contemporaries. But both of them tended to believe two things, namely, first, that provided the price level was kept more or less constant, the economic system as a whole would be basically stable, and that with the same proviso, the distribution of income was determined by the marginal productivity of the factors of production. Now, today, distributive issues have not been of interest to monetary economists for many decades. No longer are they a central concern. They have been ignored and forgotten altogether. Now, if we turn next, these were two monetary greats of a century ago. Now turn to two big names of half a century ago. I would single out Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman. Now, one thing to note about these two icons of free market conservatism is that they agree on nothing at all in the field of monetary economics. As a matter of fact, when Hayek late in life moved from the London School of Economics to the University of Chicago, he found that he was being kept out of the economics department, and he did not get to teach the economics book for which he was so famous. Friedman always took the basic neutrality of money for granted. You increase the supply of money, money stock goes up. In short order in Friedman, all prices will move proportionally, and that's the end of the story. Hayek, on the other hand, was one of the two most prominent advocates of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And in that theory, money was anything but neutral, but responsible for large and long-lasting effects on the employment and allocation of resources. Credit-driven boom-bust cycles are asymmetrical in time. They build up slowly over a long period, and then the collapse, as we just experienced, will be quick and sudden. My wife come across a reference in Hemingway's novel The Sun Also Rises, where one of the protagonists asks a friend, "How did you go bankrupt?" Two ways was the answer: gradually and then suddenly. But that's the way credit cycles work. The period that leads gradually to the recent sudden crisis has all the hallmarks of a boom in the Austrian theory. For a great many years, that Austrian theory of business cycles was kept just barely alive by a small and rather marginal group in the economics profession. For the last 60 or 70 years, macroeconomics was dominated first by Keynesian theory of a sort, then by monetarism, and most recently by dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory. An evolutionary sequence of theories that ended up in a fool's paradise that was conducive to much mathematical elaboration and thus very congenial to modern economists, but which consisted of intertemporal equilibrium models that did not incorporate any financial markets and did not offer anything at all in understanding the events of recent years. Now, interest in the Austrian theory will presumably revive somewhat. But in its original form, it predicted that an overinvestment boom would be accompanied always by inflation. Mises and Hayek had, of course, lived through the great post-World War I inflations, so they knew firsthand not only the great redistributions of wealth that these inflations brought about, but they also knew the social and political upheavals that followed in their wake. Now, in the recent events, there was not much at all in the way of CPI inflation in the run-up to the recent crisis. So some modification of the original Austrian theory is in order. And moreover, as I'm emphasizing, we have to consider whether monetary mismanagement may also have significant distributive effects, even when the price level does not change significantly. And I want to discuss how we lost control monetary system in the last couple of decades. And to touch on the structure of the financial industry, on the system of regulation of that industry, and on the monetary policies leading up to the recent years. So first, deregulation and industry structure. For some 60 years after the Great Depression, the financial system of the United States remained remarkably stable. The Glass-Steagall regulations successfully constrained the potential instability of fractional reserve banking. A number of developments in the last 20 years undermined this stability, and in 2007-2008, as we all know, the system suddenly proved dramatically and disastrously unstable. The financial structure of the United States, inherited from the 1930s, divided the financial industry into a number of distinct industries. We had commercial banks, we had savings and loan institutions, we had credit unions and investment banks and so on. It also divided it in space, because banks located in one state of the United States were prohibited from branching across the state line into other states. This structure of the financial system gave it great resilience. On another occasion, I used a metaphor of a ship that has numerous watertight compartments, so that if one compartment is breached and flooded, the entire vessel will not sink. In the recently developing field of systems design, this kind of architecture would be seen as an example of modularity. And modular systems have several advantages over integral systems. The one that's relevant to this discussion is that failure of one module leaves the rest of the system intact, whereas failure in some part of an integral system spells its total breakdown. In the old US modular system of financial intermediaries, the collapse of the saving and loan industry in the 1970s and early 1980s was contained to that industry. It did not bring down other types of banks or financial intermediaries, and of course it had no significant repercussions in other countries. In the recent crisis, losses on mortgages that were on the same order of magnitude as the losses on the S&Ls in the 70s threatened to sink the entire American financial system and to spread its chaos over the entire world. So the deregulation that turned the US financial industry into an integral system is one of several instances where the economics profession, me and you, failed spectacularly to provide a reasonable understanding of the subject matter of the discipline. The social cost of that failure has been enormous. At the time, in the 90s, the abolishment of all the regulations that prevented the different segments of finance from entering into one another's traditional markets was seen as having two obvious advantages that were obvious to any economist. And what were the advantages supposed to be? Well, on the other hand, it would increase competition, and that's always good, right? On the other hand, it would offer financial firms new tendencies to diversify risks, and that should also be good. Well, economists in general fail to understand the sound rationale of the Glass-Steagall regulations that have created the watertight compartments in the financial industry. This economic crisis has given us economists much to be modest about. One other effect of deregulation, or one other aspect of deregulation, it did great damage also in a different respect. It allowed the great investment banks to incorporate, and one by one they all became corporations in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Historically, they had been partnerships with the partners subject to essentially unlimited liability. For a long, long time, the public perception of bankers was that they were cautious, conservative people who would not lend money to anyone who actually needed money, and who were dull types that would not be the liveliest people to have home to dinner. Incorporation meant that investment banks came under limited liability and with no direct liability for its executives. Incentives for executives in the industry changed accordingly. In a few years, the public perception of investment bankers also changed. Now they are seen as jet-setting, high-rolling types. Economists in general fail to predict this change in the risk attitudes of bankers. Another item to tell us that we have much to be modest about. The methods of central banking control also changed in this period. We went from the money stock control favored by Milton Friedman and the monetarists to interest rate targeting. And that's a dramatic change in the operating doctrine of the central bank. Deregulation in the 90s and financial innovations of various sorts had combined to render the velocity of various monetary aggregates increasingly unstable and unpredictable. As a result, the monetarist policy doctrine, but only a few years earlier had held sway in many central banks, was quickly abandoned. It was replaced by the Wicksell-inspired doctrine of interest targeting. In practice, the rule now became that the central bank should maintain the repo rate constant as long as the rate of change of the CPI did not move outside of a narrow range of what was thought to be constant purchasing power. If the inflation measured by the consumer price index went above this range, the repo rate should be raised to counter it. In the opposite, of course, the banks should lower it. At the ruling repo rate, bank reserves were in very highly elastic supply. Now, this doctrine seemed to be effective because the consumer price level was indeed successfully controlled in this manner. But at the same time, the volume of bank credit issued on mortgages expanded at a great rate, fueling fueling a great boom in both commercial and residential real estate. This, of course, was a development that Axel or Hayek or Mises would not have anticipated. Why? Because in their day, it was taken for granted that bank credit was always of short term and created against real bills, and these real bills would be self-liquidated. If too much credit was flowing into the market, rising consumer prices would quickly signal the central bank that policy had to be tightened. In the early years of the present century, the credit was being created against long-term mortgages that may take up to 30 years rather than 90 days to self-liquidate. So the great expansion of credit in the long end of the market had virtually no effect on consumer goods prices in the US. The feedback that the Fed was relying on kept signaling steady as you go. There were a couple of reasons for this. Competition from Chinese imports kept the prices of American-produced consumer goods in check. And in addition, the financial boom raised incomes mostly among people in the financial industry whose consumption demand was not much exercised on the goods of the standard CPI basket. Now to monetary policy. Here is an exam question that I would suggest for central bankers. Question: does bank rate, the repo rate today, does bank rate control the price level, or does it control the real price of credit? The correct answer, of course, is one you're not allowed to give in your examination. The correct answer is, I don't know. We don't know, or we don't know how much of each. In the run-up to the recent crisis, central banks thought they were controlling the price level, but they were also keeping the real interest rate too low, and thus ended up funding a huge credit boom. The problem is obvious. You have only one instrument for two variables that you want to control. What do we do about it? The dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models that have become increasingly influential in central banks over 10 or 15 years prior to the crisis did not alert policymakers to the fact that they had a problem. Why? Because in intertemporal general equilibrium models, markets will establish the right price and volume of credit. But that solution hinges on something called the transversality condition. And what is that condition? That condition is that, simply speaking, all books will balance on the day before the end of the world. And that's a piece of mathematics with no empirical counterpart in the actual economy whatsoever. Alan Greenspan, if you remember him, he was one of the central bankers that was saving the world, according to Time magazine not long ago, belatedly recognized this problem. His recommendation was to reserve the repo rate for interest targeting to stabilize the consumer price level. To prevent bubbles from developing, he would use regulation to constrain the supply of credit. It's not clear what it would have the central bank do in the case of a collapse of credit. Maybe deregulate further. Milton Friedman would never have put faith in the transversality of these liberal models. I am sure of that. He would have insisted on holding the growth rate of the money stock constant. And an incipient credit bubble would come to strain against this nominal anchor, and this would cause real rates of interest to rise. This might not take all the air out of a bubble, but it would surely have prevented it from getting very large. The striking thing about the one instrument for two goals issue is that, of course, we should have known better. We used to know better. John Tinbergen, the recipient of the first Nobel Prize ever given 60 years ago, taught us that the number of instruments had to be at least as large as the number of goals. John Gurley and Edward Shaw, 50 years ago, insisted that the central bank needed two instruments to control money and credit. They thought that the two could be either two nominal quantities, or one quantity and one interest rates, or two interest rates. But they were corrected by Don Patinkin on that last score. Just two interest rates will not provide control of inflation. It seems our profession forgot all of this. Another thing for us to be modest about. In my view, the complete endogeneity of the monetary base associated with inflation targeting has failed us. Probably the best way to handle the two goals and one instrument problem is to move back towards control of one nominal quantity. We no longer have trust in the stability of money demand functions that the monetarists once had. Nonetheless, the feedback effect on the real interest rate that they just described would help curbing bubbles. So in the United States, I would have the Federal Reserve retake control of the monetary base. I would tie demand liabilities of all sorts, that is not just bank deposits, but also deposits with money market funds, for example, to the monetary base by reserve requirements of the old sort. To implement this recommendation, starting from the situation as we have it today, would not be a trivial task. The Fed's balance sheet has tripled and has left us with an enormously inflated monetary base, and that is not a magnitude that we would want to stabilize at this time. Moving back towards quantity control would moreover dictate a complete change in the way that the repo market for federal funds has operated in recent years. So we must first find a way out of our present difficulties before these suggestions can be seriously considered and implemented. Now, on any given day, the functioning of a market economy is governed by an intricate web of contracts and less formal promises and understandings. Errors occur in this web. Some promises are broken. For the system as a whole to work reliably, it must isolate the violated contracts and deal with them in more or less short order. And that's what happens in normal times. The violated contracts are taken into court and decided by the judicial system. But in some circumstances, as we have now been reminded, one default will trigger another. Under normal conditions, such chains of default will be short. But if the financial system has become fragile, one default can trigger an avalanche of defaults. Most avalanches of this sort are small, self-limiting. But in extreme cases, they can take down very large proportions of the web of contracts. And a major collapse of the web of contracts will be associated with a breakdown in economic organization of a country and with widespread unemployment of labor and other resources. It's even more serious than that. A default avalanche leaves a myriad of broken promises in its wake. Social relations are disrupted by distrust and recriminations all around. Effective political action becomes almost impossible. Extremist movements on the right and on the left threaten the stability of the political order. It's of the utmost importance, therefore, that the great collapse of the web is stopped one way or another. But halting a collapse, if you succeed in doing it, brings intractable political problems also. The financial crash reveals a large collective miscalculation of economic value. The incidence of the losses resulting from such miscalculation has to be worked out before the economy can begin to function normally again. Because the process of a crash is unstable, it cannot be left for the markets and bankruptcy courts to work out the eventual incident. If we had done so this time, if we had not intervened, it would simply have led us into another Great Depression. This means that political choices have to be made to determine who bears the losses from this collective miscalculation. Obviously, such choices are terribly difficult. Yet temporizing can prolong the period of subnormal economic performance indefinitely, as the history of Japan over the last 20+ years illustrates. But the questions that demand an answer are of the utmost political difficulty. Who must be paid? Who does not get paid? Who must, in effect, pay for somebody else's debt? Who gets away without paying? And so forth. Once the issues are spelled out in this way, the impossibility of a broad political consensus becomes obvious. The distribution of the losses will strike a great many people as without rhyme or reason. The room for effective political action in a democracy becomes very tightly circumscribed. In practice, governments are apt to rely heavily, if not exclusively, on monetary policy. Massive injections of liquidity will postpone explicit distributional measures and may make some of them avoidable, since postponement of reckoning will enable some debtors to save themselves. Most of all, reliance on monetary policy has the great inestimable advantage that the distributive consequences of central bank actions are so little understood by the general public. But relying exclusively on monetary policy also has some unpalatable consequences. It tends to recreate large rewards to the bankers that were instrumental in creating the unstable structure that eventually crashed. it also runs some risk. It means that you double down on the policy that brought you into severe trouble to begin with. We are now, what do I mean by doubling down? I mean that today we are trying to cure the situation that we've gotten into by bringing the central bank interest rate, the repo rate, basically to 0, 0.2 or 1%. How did we get into the trouble to begin with? We got into the trouble to begin with by having interest rates that were too low. We're not trying to get out of it by having interest rates that are still low. Let me now turn to the third part of my topic, which was distribution. In the years leading up to the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was a great shift in the distribution of income in the United States. It became very much more unequal. The big gainers in the 1920s were at the top of the distribution, and they were in banking and in finance. In the years leading up to the present crisis, the same type of change in the distribution of income has also occurred. The gains are all at the top end and almost all in finance. Is this coincidental? I very much doubt it. In interpreting the events of these two periods, I have relied, as we heard, on the Austrian theory of the business cycle. I argued that the lack of consumer price inflation in the upstream, which the Austrian theory would normally predict, had been due to the change in income distribution in favor of income classes whose marginal propensity to spend on the goods in the CPI basket is low. But this leaves the question of how to explain the change in the income distribution itself. The literature on the Austrian theory is extensive, and I'm far from familiar with all of it, but to my knowledge, Hayek and Mises and company did not pay much attention to income distribution. A great part of this change in the distribution of income that has taken place is due, I believe, to the privileges that bankers have come to enjoy under our present monetary arrangement. And I will discuss 3 bankers' privileges at some length. The first banker's privilege is follows. Generations of economic students have been taught that banks create money. However, the context in which the money creation process is usually explained is one in which the volume of high-powered money is fixed, and bank reserves therefore a scarce resource. Competition between banks in that setting ensures that banks and bankers earn no more than a normal return. But this is no longer descriptive of the conditions under which banks operate. Today, total reserves in the banking system vastly exceed the reserves required against deposits. Even when this is not the case, the big conglomerate investment banks face a highly elastic supply of reserves at the repo rate set by the central bank. Now, that is not quite the same thing as a license to print money. But when reserve requirements pose no constraint and the repo rate is significantly below the rate on assets that the banks can acquire, this is certainly the next best thing to a license to print money. With a central bank that's practically committed to not allowing the yield curve to turn downward slowly, the banks feel safe, operating at very high leverage, making lots of money, and letting their managers take home big slices of the proceeds. Let me take this argument 2 steps further to illustrate. First, suppose we do give the banks the privilege to print legal tender. Suppose the government charges a fee for the exercise of the privilege. Let's say that they have to pay 0.2% per year, or whatever the repo rate is, for printing money. Would this make a significant difference vis-à-vis today's arrangements? It would make some difference, but not a big significance. Secondly, why reserve the privilege for the banks? Suppose we let ordinary citizens borrow in the repo market at the same rate as the banks, against good collateral. The cost of having the central bank engage in this kind of retail lending to you and me would be considerable, of course. They might not be higher than some other government programs, such as agricultural subsidies, or oil depletion allowances, or a few days' worth of war on foreign soil, for example. If subsidizing access to the repo window is found objectionable, well, let the citizen borrower in the repo market be charged the transaction cost. He might still consider it profitable to refinance his mortgage in this manner. Admittedly, their operation would not be without risks, since the maturity mismatch is rather extreme if you refinance a 30-year mortgage in the repo market. And the risk is significant, since the ordinary citizens would know himself not to be too big to pay, but he knows himself to be too small to save. But for the time being, of course, his housing cost would be very, very low indeed if he could access them. Now, I wouldn't have you take this proposal altogether seriously. But this little analytical exercise of letting non-bankers in on the repo market does, I submit, throw light on our present arrangements. Allowing non-bank agents to compete in this way would obviously do away with abnormal profits in the banking industry, and it would reduce the fortunes of bankers to something more like what the rest of us are accustomed to. There's another banker's privilege that I want to point out. I mentioned before that both Fisher and Axel thought that price level stability was a sufficient condition for avoiding distributive effects. This may have been true in their time, but it's no longer true. To see this, consider the following. The Fed is supplying the banks with reserves at a near zero rate. Not much in the way of bank lending to business results from this, but the banks can buy treasuries that pay 3 to 4% with the free money. This hefty subsidy to the banking system is ultimately borne by the taxpayers, since the taxpayers is liable for the interest and repayment on those bonds. And you should note that neither the subsidy nor the tax liability has been voted on by Congress. This Fed policy has now driven down the interest rates paid to savers to some small fraction of 1%. At the same time, banks leverage their capital by a factor of 15 or so, thus earning a truly outstanding return from buying treasuries with costless Fed money or very nearly costless deposits. Wall Street bankers are then able once again to claim the bonuses they became used to in the good old days, and to which they feel entitled because of the genius required to perform this operation, borrowing money at 0 rate and buying 3%. These bonuses are in fact transfers from taxpayers, as well as from the mostly aged savers, who cannot find alternative safe placements for their funds in retirement. The Fed low interest rate policy has turned into a shell game for the members of the general public who are unable to follow how the money flows from losses to gain. You know what a shell game is. It's finding the pea under 3 little cups. The bailouts of the banks during the crisis were clear for all to see and caused widespread outrages among the public. Now the public is being told that the banks have repaid these bailouts at no cost to the taxpayer. But what has actually happened, of course, and what the public is not told, is that the prepayments come to a substantial extent out of the revenues paid by taxpayers for the banks to hold treasuries that they buy with money borrowed at 0%. In the US, both parties supported the bailout, so neither party seemed ready to protest the false claim that they are being repaid at no cost to the taxpayer. So political action to rectify this matter is certainly not to be expected. The third point, banker's privilege. I brought this up before. Not so very long ago, the American investment banks were partnerships. The law that permitted them to incorporate is only about 25 years old. Within a decade after its passage, all the big investment banks had taken advantage of it. Partnerships operate under unlimited liability, and the liability falls on the partners as individuals. Corporations, of course, are limited liability companies, and the limited liability does not fall on their executives. The change of legal form had a predictable effect on behavior, but it's safe to say that few economists predicted how dramatic this change was going to be. We have, again, much to be modest about. At one time, as I said, bankers were generally perceived as cautious and conservative, and now they have become jet-setting hierarchy. The underlying reason is that the partners of all the investment banks had unlimited liability, and it was their own fortunes that were at stake, and that is no longer the case. Now to wrap up, the present monetary policy achieves two aims. One aim has been to recapitalize the banks, and to do so without the government acquiring an equity stake in the banks. The government in the United States in particular does not want to be charged with nationalization or socialism. So the banks have to be given the funds to recapitalize outright. Economists have agonized a lot lately about the zero lower bound of the interest rate as an obstacle to effective policy in the present circumstances. This agony over the zero lower bound of interest rate seems to me misplaced. As long as the big banks are to be subsidized, why not just pay them to accept reserves from the friendly central bank. Oh well, come to think of it, today US banks are paid interest on the reserve. Second aim, of course, is to prevent the housing bubble from deflating all the way. And in this respect, the policy is now having some effect. Homeowners whose bonuses are not underwater can often refinance at long-term rates around 4% or even 3%. The distributional effects of this policy do not seem to be widely understood. If they were, it is difficult to imagine that it would be let pass with so little opposition. Economists have not done much to inform the public on this issue, another matter on which we should be modest about. The policy is not without risks either. I mentioned before that 40 years ago the American savings and loan industry was ruined by inflation raising the rates they had to pay to retain deposits above the rates earned on the long-term mortgages they had previously granted. Now, if the economy in the near future were to return to historically more normal interest rates, we would have a rerun of this episode as well. That is, we would find interest rates going above the rates that the banks earn on long-term assets that they have acquired. The difference today, of course, is that some of the lenders are now considered too big to fail, so they will have to be bailed out yet another time. To the extent that present policy succeeds inducing the banks to load up on long-term low-yield assets, a return to more normal rates would then spell trouble. Now, the alternative is that the US might suffer years of slow deflation like Japan. That would return, the return to higher rates will be long postponed. At present, we have a situation where strong deflationary pressures in the economy are balanced, kept at bay by equally strong inflationary policies, where the authorities have tripled the balance sheet of the central bank. That balance is an uncomfortable kind of equilibrium. If the US escapes the Japanese syndrome, the Federal Reserve will sooner or later have to raise rates to stem inflation or to defend the dollar. One last point concerning central bank independence. For the last 20 or 30 years, political independence of central banks has been a popular idea among academic economists, and of course an idea heavily endorsed by central bankers. Now, this independence, of course, has not been much in evidence in the recent crisis, but the central banks would very much like to get back to this independence from political pressure. The independence doctrine, however, is predicated on the distributional neutrality of central bank policy. Once it is realized, as I think it must be realized, that monetary policy has all sorts of distributional effects, this independence doctrine becomes impossible to defend in a democratic society. You cannot have central bankers without political responsibility make decisions that change the distribution of income in society. It is not clear to me that the economics profession has drawn this conclusion yet. So that is another issue that we should be modest about. Thank you very much.